Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Velandia, and welcome to this masterclass entitled The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, the Model Marines in the Korean War, organized as a part of the training complement of the Master in Military History of INISEG and the Research Group in Military History. Our commitment, rigorous training, and historical analysis drive us to offer this type of meetings with experts in field, allowing students and researchers to develop deeper into the key events that have marked war history. Today brings together a crucial episode of the 20th century, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, a decisive engagement during the United States Marine Corps, and left valuable lessons of the both tactical and human levels. Today we are privileged to be joined by experts in field who will guide us through this detailed analysis and answer your questions at the end of the session. In order for all attendees to make the most of the space, we will detail the methodology we will follow. And first, we will begin the presentation of the speakers. Then we will follow the question and answer block. At the end of the presentation, we will have the space to answer your question during the session. We ask you to write down the question to us at the end of the session, and there will be also leave a space for you to ask your question. Remember to raise your hand so we can give you the floor. So, and then we will close the event. Also, I invite you to review the information we are posting of INISEG's focus on military history, intelligence, public and private security, and cybersecurity, and where you can all register and participate. So now I would like to start by introducing the organizer of this event, David Kaisal, that is military historian, director of the security and defense area of INISEG, director of the research group of International Center for Advanced Research in Security and Defense of INISEG, membership in support of Association of the United States Army, advisory member of the Military Law and Security Section of the Madrid Bar Association, member of the research group of INISEG and the University and Agency Partnership Program, University Program of the Dissemination of the United States Defense Culture, and member of the Association of Historians of Catalonia. So welcome, David, and the audience is yours to start with an introduction of this masterclass. David, te cedo la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Laura, por la presentación. Nada, una breve introducción histórica a la masterclass que nos va a realizar el coronel Philip Rogers, del Cuerpo de Marines, sobre la batalla del Embalse de Chosin durante la Guerra de Corea. Para introducirnos en un antecedente y un contexto histórico, recordemos que la batalla de la reserva de Chosin fue una de las batallas más importantes de la Guerra de Corea, entre 1950 y 1953. Recordemos que la entrada de China en el conflicto, apoyando a Corea del Norte, pues va a cambiar el curso de la guerra por completo. Los surcoreanos y sus aliados de las Naciones Unidas vieron privados de esa victoria final hasta que entonces parecía que estar al alcance de la mano y fueron obligados a retroceder hasta el paralelo 38, o lo que es lo mismo, a la frontera artificial que dividía las dos Coreas, ¿no? En dos países con sistemas políticos totalmente opuestos, Corea del Norte comunista y Corea del Sur capitalista. Militarmente, la batalla supuso un duro golpe para el 10º Cuerpo de Ejército norteamericano, que de pronto pues, se vio cercado por los ejércitos chinos y tuvo que realizar un dramático esfuerzo para romper ese cerco y escapar hacia el sur, evitando así el aniquilamiento de sus unidades. Pero lo más destacado fue que esta batalla reinstauró el equilibrio de poder entre ambos bandos en conflicto en Corea. Tras el desembarco de Incheon, acontecido el 15 de septiembre de 1950, el arrollador avance de esas tropas norteamericanas del general MacArthur, a través de Corea del Norte, había empujado a las tropas norcoreanas hasta la frontera con China. Parecía que solo faltaba un último empuje más y la guerra acabaría con una rotunda victoria de Corea del Sur y sus aliados de Naciones Unidas. Sin embargo, el gobierno comunista de China había decidido respaldar a Corea del Norte, ya que veía como una amenaza tener a los surcoreanos capitalistas y prooccidentales en su frontera sur. Así que de esa manera, el 19 de octubre de 1950, miles de soldados chinos comenzaron a infiltrarse secretamente en Corea del Norte para desencadenar una contraofensiva contra las fuerzas norteamericanas y de Naciones Unidas. Pese a tener la supremacía aérea, el movimiento de estas ingentes cantidades de tropas, de soldados chinos y de suministros pasó completamente inadvertido para los aliados. Otro factor que permitió la infiltración masiva de los ejércitos chinos fue la poca importancia que los aliados le habían otorgado, considerándolos poco más o menos como una turba de campesinos sin experiencia militar y sin armas. Además, si los aliados habían conseguido derrotar al ejército norcoreano armado y entrenado por los soviéticos, no sería aún más fácil poder derrotar a los inexpertos chinos. Los hechos posteriores van a demostrar que los aliados estaban completamente equivocados y que su opinión sobre el soldado chino era completamente errónea. Mientras tanto, MacArthur seguía adelante con su ofensiva destinada a obtener la victoria final. El octavo ejército norteamericano, con 135.000 soldados, avanzaba por la costa oeste de Corea del Norte, mientras el 10º cuerpo de Estados Unidos, con unos 100.000 hombres, al mando del general Edward Almond, tras desembarcar en Wonsan, avanzaba por la costa este para acabar con los últimos núcleos de resistencia norcoreana. Ambos cuerpos estaban apoyados por divisiones de soldados surcoreanos y tropas de Naciones Unidas. Y hasta aquí este breve resumen histórico de la batalla del Embalse de Chosin, para dar paso a nuestro ponente, que nos ampliará continuamente la información sobre esta impresionante batalla de la Guerra de Corea. Muchas gracias, Laura.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation and excellent start to the event. So now let's welcome, and I have the pleasure to introduce Colonel Philip Rogers. U.S. Marine Corps Colonel Rogers is the authoritative voice on military history with an outstanding academic and operational background. His expertise is the study of the 20th century conflicts coupled with his first-hand knowledge of Marine Corps strategic culture, will provide a unique and rigorous perspective of what happened at Chosin. So let's welcome Colonel Phillips. Thank you so much for joining us, and the audience is all yours to begin your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I think it's been a little while since I presented a class. And I want to thank David and Laura, of course, for always allowing me to talk about the Marine Corps. Although, of course, it wasn't just the Marine Corps that participated in the battle. The Army was the lead effort. But this is, as we've covered a lot of things like Guadalcanal and Belleau Wood, this is one of the premier battles that goes down into Marine Corps history, which is steeped in history. This year, we celebrate 250 years of existence. I know that compared to a lot of countries around the world, that's new. But for us, the Marine Corps was founded before we were actually a republic, and then the Army shortly before us. This is a complicated subject. The North Korean campaign is, even though relatively speaking, it was a shorter war. Really, the actions go from 1950 in July to 51, but then really to 54 as far as the battles that go back and forth. But the major events that you could probably say that happened, besides this kind of the static back and forth trench warfare and DMZ lines, happened in 1950 and then into 1951. But we're going to concentrate on this particular battle or subset, which was a strategic either victory or defeat, depending upon how you look at it. You can see my agenda there. The Chosin Reservoir, it's legendary in the Corps. They go by the Chosin Few, is a play on the words, obviously, and that's a name of a famous book. The fighting campaign that happened in not only encountering the Chinese in the first real large fighting that we had done against the communist Chinese forces and the People's Volunteer Army, but it was also a show of force in how Esprit de Corps managed to keep the United States Marine Corps intact in that fight in the 1st Marine Division and the Army units as well, as they exfiltrated through an 87-mile corridor eventually to the exfiltration point and the evacuation point in Hungnam, which is something I'll get to in a little bit. I'll talk about the Korean War in the November 1950, the strategic context before the fighting actually starts in late November. We'll talk about the Chinese, of course. At this particular point, the Republic of the People's Republic of Korea, at that particular time, were on their backs. It was the Chinese actually that were right now taking over the mantle of fighting. We'll discuss that. We'll talk about the Marines, the Army, the Navy, the brand new U.S. Air Force, and then also the Allies, because they played a significant part in the fighting as well. Now, this was the great equalizer. There are a lot of great equalizers in a lot of either in football or rugby or fighting. And one of the things that certainly played against or for both of the forces was the extreme cold and extreme weather that they had to contend with. And we'll discuss how that affected not only anything that you had as far as numerical superiority in forces or superiority in firepower and equipment that certainly the Allies had an advantage over the Chinese. We'll talk about the heroes, the battles themselves, and I like to separate it into three different parts of the battle to kind of explain it for the laymen, if you will, and then there are parts we can get into more depth and discussion. We'll talk about the heroes from the American side. There are certainly from the Chinese side as well, but that is not as well researched, nor did I dwell on that. I wanted to highlight some of the heroes and some of the significant actions that happen, like I do at most of these lectures. The aftermath, what was the toll? What were the consequences? How did it affect the rest of the campaign? And then we'll talk about a little bit of the lore and the legacy. I want to make two caveats. It's also called, if you do your research, the Chosin Reservoir Campaign. But if you type in Chosin, as you see it spelled here, the Chosin, that is the Japanese translation or equivalent of the Korean designation, which is called the Battle of Lank. And I'm not going to pretend like I can pronounce it Shangjin, but Changjin. You might see it as that. Matter of fact, there are some books that talk about Shangjin instead of Chosin the whole way. Also, it's a little bit confusing as far as the dates. There are various dates. That's why I had an asterisk on the title slide, because it really starts in mid-November. Actually, on the 10th of November is when we started encountering, the U.S. forces started encountering Chinese forces, which is the Marine Corps' birthday. And then as you progress, really it's the 27th of December through the 13th to the 16th of this November, 27th November through the 13th to the 16th of December. Again, you'll see various dates, but essentially that encapsulates those few weeks right there, essentially what happened throughout the Chosin Reservoir leading up to the evacuation. All right, next slide, please. All right, so as far as I like to always bring up a little bit of the legendary part of it, is part of the lore of the Corps. That's why I have to always remember that not everybody is steeped in Marine Corps history as we are. Part of our training and indoctrination as far as being Marines is, whether you're an officer or enlisted, is we constantly reflect back on our history. We talk about the most famous battles, whether that's Guadalcanal, Bellawood, Iwo Jima. Chosin is right up there. The Incheon invasion or the amphibious landing that right before Chosin is also very famous. So these are the things that really make up who we are in the United States Marine Corps. And you can see the picture of Chesty Puller there. But this is part of our lore. And so if I'm trying not to gloss over things that I just intuitively know, and I've read at least 10 to 12 books on Korea, if not more. And I actually did a studies and master's degree on studying. One of the classes was on the war, and you can look at it from an Army perspective, from a Marine Corps perspective. The French had a Legionnaire unit that was there, led by a famous Legionnaire named Ralph Monclar. Maybe all Legionnaires are famous. There was the Gloucester Regiment. There were 16 Allied nations that fought alongside each other as part of a UN force. And so I will focus on the core, but certainly there'll be other elements I'm going to talk about. And then this was a strategic battle during the Korean War. And this can be looked at as not the precipitating event that would lead to the war getting to a stalemate, but it certainly was a very strategic battle, and it set the conditions for the Chinese to advance to the 38th parallel. Now, over the next few years after that, it would be back and forth across the 38th parallel as things were being determined in peace talks. And then I'll talk about this a little bit. That war has never officially ended. It is an armistice right now. But when we serve in Korea, as far as Marines or Americans or Air Force, other allies as well, it is part of a 30,000 person force we still have to this day, which will either decrement or increment depending upon activities or depending upon what the leaders of Korea are doing, or depending upon how we're postured. Sometimes it's for exercises we do throughout the year. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's still relevant today. These are a few things that, you'll see Chesty Puller. This is a famous picture. Whether he actually said this or not, when he was, when the forces were surrounded, when the American forces of 30,000 were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese forces, the 9th Army Corps, composed of 12 divisions of Chinese. When he found out he was surrounded, it was either Oliver Smith that you see pictured in the middle or Chesty Puller that said, "We're surrounded. That simplifies our problem. We can attack in any direction." So it wasn't never considered a retreat. It was just attacking in a different direction, if you want to put it in Marine Corps terms. And Lieutenant General Chesty Puller, he was a colonel at the time in charge of a regiment. He ends up being the most decorated Marine ever and retires as Lieutenant General in the United States Marine Corps. And then Oliver Smith later became the assistant commandant in the Marine Corps and a 4-star. On the Chinese side was General Song Shilun, and I put PLA there, but it's really, that's a misnomer. It's really the PVA, the People's Volunteer Army, because what I think what the Army, the Chinese were trying to do was say, look, these are volunteer forces. They're fighting on behalf of the proxy North Koreans. But he had gone through almost a constant career of fighting for the Chinese, whether it was against the Japanese or on the Chinese side of the communist side, the Chinese Civil War. He was a definite, and he's not the only general that participated, but for the Chosin Reservoir, yes, General Song Shilun was definitely a warrior, knew how to fight, knew how to surprise the enemy, knew how to recalculate after initial advances were stymied or after they had setbacks, and he fought a good fight all the way to the end. Now, at the end, and I'll get to this in a little bit, the 9th Army Corps was essentially considered no longer serviceable, and it wasn't to see action for another year or two. Such was the beating that was taken by and I'll talk about the casualties at the end. But essentially, these are the two sides, and this is why, and I'm sure on the Chinese side, this is a legendary as well. But this is what is part of our Marine Corps history and lore. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry if there's a little bit of music in the background. I live on a street where there's a great square. So anyway, if you hear it, I'll try to drown it out. Okay, the strategic contract. This is not the best map. I wish I could have found a better one, but this shows essentially, eventually where we are in the fighting. I'm not going to go over what initially happened in the war. Just let it be known that the North Koreans, by themselves, essentially caught the Americans and the South Koreans by surprise in the summer of July and August 1950, and advanced all the way down to Pusan, which is the lowest right-hand corner, and I've been there before, the lowest right-hand corner city that you see, and the forces for the America, and essentially it's the Pusan perimeter is where you see the green arrows on land emanating from. Task Force 50 or Task Force Smith, because it was in charge by General Smith, it was a peacetime force. We had been done with World War II in 1945. This is 5 years later. Even though there were some indications and warnings, no one really thought the Koreans would be able to fight as well as they did. When they launched their offensive, it caught Task Force Smith by surprise, and Americans by surprise, and the South Koreans by surprise. And it wasn't until they were bound to the Pusan perimeter and the river that goes, that essentially surrounds Pusan, that they finally stopped the advancing forces and were able to reverse the tide. At that point, it was like, let's stop the North Koreans somewhere or anywhere. And it ended up being, like I said, the Pusan perimeter. But this is where the launch off and the fight back happened. And you can see the several arrows as they go up the eastern coast, the western coast of Korea Peninsula, and also to the center. But of course, what's very powerful is the Incheon landing, an amphibious landing. Some people said wasn't really necessary or not, but it was daring from a MacArthur perspective. And it essentially reversed the tide of war. Not only were the North Koreans being pushed back and losing weaponry, air support was coming in from the mainland, forces and reservists were being activated from the States and from other countries. The UN sent allies as well, and I have the list of allies as they arrived by name in sequence, and some of them were actually surprising when I had to review that. I had thought about some of these in a while, but Incheon essentially cut off their lines, and then it became a rout as the Allied forces were heading up to the north. The U.S. forces actually started fighting as a joint force too. There eventually would be 5 carriers off the coast. Now, these aren't the super carriers that you see nowadays, but they certainly brought a lot of momentum. And then also land-based aircraft, either flying from Japan or flying into southern bases in Korea and then moving on from there. And part of the campaign along the way was, and the way we do close air support in the Marine Corps was, we would develop expeditionary fields as we move northward. And so aircraft were able to not necessarily have to go all the way back to the carrier, but even as we do this today, able to land, refuel, rearm, and then go right back to the front lines without having to go all the way back to sea, all the way back to Japan. Now, there were two different fights. There was the Air Force deep fight, and the Air Force fights air-to-air combat, more or less. And they were doing a lot of fighting versus Chinese, and we think Russians as well, trained pilots. And I'll try to remind me at the end. I'll talk about the Russian involvement in a little bit here towards the end. I don't really talk about it here during the Chosin, but of course, it was looked at as a proxy communist fight. At this particular point, when the Allied forces are now looking into September, October, the tide has been reversed, and MacArthur is pushing to the Yalu River and trying to essentially do what we have done, and as far as an American perspective, fight till we have an unconditional surrender. So the thought was, let's move to the north, let's move to the Yalu River, let's push them all the way back to the border, and we don't think the Chinese are going to come across. MacArthur also had publicized that, we want everybody home by Christmas, and every time you say that, you're bound to stay longer than Christmas. So a lesson learned for anybody who says we're going to be home at a certain time. Now, there were rumors, and more importantly, there's definitive human intelligence, listening, signal intelligence, captured Chinese soldiers, whether they be privates or senior, that were actually identified and professing that, yes, they were part of a larger communist effort coming across. But I think the U.S. forces were in denial. One, maybe not a little bit too concerned about it. I think MacArthur thought he had a nuclear option in his back pocket as well, which we knew that was not going to happen. And there was some contention between him and the president upon that. But essentially, it was forewarned and forecast, and Chinese were being caught not only in small numbers, but in larger numbers. And there was initial contact with Chinese forces. But I don't think nobody at the time thought it was really going to be in the numbers of the hundreds of thousands and the onslaught of the Chinese forces that would come. This was ignored by the Allies. Again, and I have a note there. I talked about it a little bit earlier. You'll see Chosin versus Chang'an Reservoir. Okay, next slide, please. Chinese. Now, this isn't the best Chinese picture. It's almost like from a model kit. And I couldn't really find some good ones that didn't have North Koreans in it too. But the Chinese at this particular point, they were fighters. They had been fighting against the Japanese since, as you know, before World War II officially kicked off. And so there had been a long training, if you will, for Chinese popular forces. And even though what they didn't have as far as technology necessarily, what they had was masses and numbers. And they've been fighting, again, the Japanese for years. And then they've been fighting, not only were they fighting with Americans from perspective of fighting from Taiwan at the time, or, against the communist forces once World War II ended. But then it became a Chinese civil war where there were generals and soldiers who'd been fighting for years and who had been absolutely conditioned in combat and were tough. The massing tactics is what essentially they would use, although some soldiers, there is records of soldiers running into the battle, not necessarily carrying rifles, but expecting to pick up rifles off the ground off their dead comrades or wounded comrades. They had older type at that time, contemporary type of Soviet-style tanks, some aircraft as well. But really, it was just the mass of forces they could bring. And in this particular instance, even though there ended up being hundreds and hundreds of thousands, it was 120,000 troops in the 9th Army Corps in the 12 divisions that ended up being mobilized and sent across to capture the forces or to stymie the forces at Chosin. In mid-fall, after Incheon and Yalu being threatened, that's when the Chinese really started amassing and coming across the Yalu in droves. Now, there was indications of this by fighter aircraft that were seeing this. The U.S. Air Force aircraft and Allied aircraft were seeing these forces moving, but the Chinese were very, very good at moving at night. We don't have the same sensors. They didn't have the same sensors as we do nowadays, where night is our preferred battlefield as far as advanced forces go, not only the Americans, but other allies and adversaries today. But at that particular time, they were masters of camouflage. They were great at coming off and not staying on the main roads. They would move through the mountains. They were pushed hard. And I would say that the general, they were actually supposed to be outfitted with cold weather gear in Mongolia. But because of the precipitous fall of the North Koreans as they were moving to Yalu, a lot of them went into battle with no winter gear. Like I talked about, not much weapons, not much support. They were hard driven. They were pressed into moving very quickly. And they took pride in moving across mountain ranges and with little support, only what they could carry, type of thing. Now, they suffered many casualties accordingly, but that's something that was really characteristic of the Chinese. Okay, next slide, please.
David, next
I don't know if I
siguiente.
lost David or not, but and when is while I'm talking here, I can just at least talk to. You can see the picture of the Chinese there. Again, that's not a very good picture. That's probably a fully outfitted
Yeah.
unit, but you can see the standard weapons that are used by Russians at that particular time, not AKs at the time, but the predecessors. And there was David again. Okay, next slide, please. Good pause. Okay, now, of course, a little bit more talking about what I know. You can see the picture there of General MacArthur, a self-styled, five-star general who was also considered himself a Caesar to a particular point. And then, I bring in a picture of carrier aviation. Those are some of our more modern carriers after World War II, although a lot of the equipment that we were using was World War II, like any big war that America's been through, specifically at that time. There is a huge disarmament of forces. Let's get back to regular business. Let's get back to what happens in the continent of the United States or Hawaii and Alaska. And so we find ourselves again and again, every time that we ignore peace through strength, that we're going to find ourselves playing catch up. Now, the industrial might of the U.S. at that particular point was able to quickly rearm and get reservists signed up and ready to go. Believe it or not, there was a lot of youth that were not happy they had missed the end of World War II or just were an occupation force in Germany. So there was actually, when the war was just kicked off, there was a rush for people to sign up and join. Now, 4 years later, it was a different story because it had just become a morass of a stalemate. At this particular point, Task Force Smith no longer existed. It was General Allman, who was in charge of 10th Corps, that really led the fight. And General Allman would end up dying in a car wreck, unfortunately. But he led the fighting, and he was the overall mastermind with MacArthur push up through the peninsula. The Marines, I put the 7th Marine Regiment there, but it was really the 1st Marine Division and the 1st Marine Air Wing. And those are the divisions that come out of the West Coast. And so that's primarily where they came from. Now, anytime you have a Marines, we source from all over the units of the Marine Corps. And so where we had been at 500,000 after World War II, immediately after, we had gone back down to 75,000 or 100,000 or something like that. So anyway, reservists are coming in. 7th Marine Regiment will play a major role, but also, like I said, the 1st, the 5th Marine Regiment are the 3 parts of the division. And then we had the 11th Marines, which are the artillery regiment. The Navy had brought in the carriers, 5 carriers. Now, there are Marines that fly off the carriers as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, all the transports. I'll talk about this later, but there ended up being over 190 ships and transports for the exfiltration and the evacuation at Hungnam at the end. And also a lot of the ships have brought in the amphibious ships at the time had brought in the forces that struck at Inchon, which were the Marines primarily and also Army as well. The U.S. Air Force was a fledgling service created in 1947. It originated as the U.S. Army Air Corps. It was separated into its own separate service in the United States. It flew and believed in flying deep missions. They thought that, and still there's always a fighter bomber aspect in the Air Force, whereas should we do bombing? Is it a fighter? Is it both? Is it air superiority? At one point, it was, well, since we have nuclear weapons, let's just use B-52s. But that's not the answer when you're not in a nuclear campaign or war. And after, obviously, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we haven't dropped nuclear weapons. But this is where the U.S. Air Force is cutting its teeth as a separate service. The UK had an independent commando brigade, and I bring that up because the 41st Independent Brigade, I think underneath a Lieutenant Colonel Ragsdale, if I have that name correctly, it ended up being called Task Force Ragsdale, fought alongside the Marines and at Chosin as well. But just to give you the kind of a scale of the UN allies involved, there was a mix of brigades from 16 different countries, and I have them deployed in arrival order: United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Netherlands, Canada, France, New Zealand, Philippines, Turkey, which were a tough force. And if I get to it, I'll talk a little bit about their performance in the in the prison camps, which was absolutely eye-watering. Nobody matched the Turks as far as toughness. Thailand, South Africa, Greece, Belgium, Luxembourg. And if I ever knew that Ethiopia and Colombia were involved, then I was refreshed that they were. So this was a UN-sanctioned fight, and smaller forces, obviously, but contributing. And I have the French regiment down there as a picture. And I say here the South Koreans are all but decimated. That's a little bit of a mischaracterization. They were still fighting on the western flank, and they were still fighting unopposed to a certain point and racing up to the north. But the Republic of Korea forces, which are much, much, much more viable today and a tougher force, then were, of course, floating along the coattails and fighting as well, I must say, with the Allied forces as they moved to the north. So they were fighting in their war as well. But there's a lot of pieces here going on. And why I bring that up is because not only is because it's important to know that there was a combined effort here, is that we're fighting as a joint force, which is something we have still learning to do all the way up into the Grenada invasion. And it wasn't really that we mastered it as a truly joint force until Panama, but there is a tendency for all of our services to fight independent fights as we go into war, where we fight best as we're combined and with our allies as a joint force and a combined force. But I also wanted to make sure that you understood that it wasn't just a monolith of Chinese coming and they can just call the shots with the North Koreans to support. You've got a combined command where you have to take the allies' considerations into consideration. And like Winston Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. So, and to this day, there's still a UN presence in Korea. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is the great equalizer. Like I said, it is cold in Korea. I've been in Korea in the wintertime. It is absolutely freezing. And I used to fly F-18s out of Iwakuni, Japan, and we would have to wear cold weather suits because if you ejected into the water, your life expectancy was maybe 10 minutes. It's that cold. So this was, they didn't have cold weather suits back then and they were flying off carriers, but this is the kind of biting cold that you just cannot hide from, even with the best cold weather gear in the world. But there was also an uncharacteristically strong cold front that came in from Mongolia. And during the height of the fighting, when we're talking about negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Celsius, I hope I did the conversion correctly. Anyway, it was cold. And they were talking about Marines. It was so cold, it was frozen, permafrost, 18 inches down. So trying to dig a trench or trying to dig a foxhole when you're trying to survive fire is something that is just so hard when you're trying to do it with your hands, ungloved hands perhaps, or even if you had an e-tool and a trenching tool or some kind of way to excavate, it was very difficult. Frostbite, trench foot, because nobody wants to take off their shoes when it's cold, but that's when you get infections of the foot. And it wasn't long before if you lost a glove or if you were holding onto a weapon and you fell asleep, the frostbite on your hands. And that's what caused a lot of casualties on both sides. People were not prepared equipment-wise. You went from, and I've been in Korea also in sweating profusely in August, and it's so humid. Like if you ever see the Olympics when they happen there, they have to take consideration of how hot and humid it is. Japan as well. But September, October, and then it could switch almost overnight. So the forces from Mongolia that were coming in had not been equipped correctly. And then also the U.S. forces that were fighting were thinking that they were going to be home by Christmas. They didn't have to worry about that. That's on the tail end of the supply chain. And before you know it, you're trapped in a place that cannot be resupplied very quickly, even though helicopters were starting to fly at that time, even though C-47s were dropping equipment. It's just never enough. And so there were people who were literally fighting in their regular camouflage uniforms, maybe some boots without cold weather gear. Maybe they got gloves, maybe a blanket or two, but it was tough. Weapons were jamming. Rereading about stories of even if you could fire your weapon and keep it somehow warm, the springs were just so cold, they would only allow you to shoot one round and then you'd have to unjam it and clean out the weapon again and then shoot. That just makes, especially when you're in a gunfight, very, very difficult. Guns freezing. When I say guns, the big guns, the oil, the lubrication that's used in the cannons or the weaponry, just frozen. Vehicles. You couldn't let the vehicles shut down. Of course, you're going to run out of fuel if you keep running them, but otherwise everything would just freeze up and then you couldn't get the vehicle started again. rations were frozen. They were talking about stories of guys walking with cans of peaches and maybe a bit old biscuits, and you just had to warm it with your body warmth. And God forbid what the Chinese were having to deal with. And the medicine too. Morphine was completely frozen, and the docs would have to put it in their mouths to warm it up. Obviously not injecting it in their mouths or in their armpits, whatever the case, just to apply it. And when you have casualties at the cyclic rate that are happening in Korea, medicine can quickly turn it from a simple wound to you're an extremist and you're going to die. It was disabling, prohibitive, an equalizer, whatever you want to call it. So whatever advantage. And oh, by the way, 27 November, there was a cloud cover, so the aircraft could not fly as well all the way up until December 1st. Now, December 1st, when the withdrawal is happening, the air cover clears, the air clouds clear, and now the close air support can come in. It wasn't all weather bombing back then. Now, this coupled with the terrain is about as tough as it can get in combat. And, I've done a lot of flying in combat. I've done some, desert combat, but I have not fought in the mountains, although I've been to the Mountain Warfare Training Center in California, Northern California, where it gets really cold. It is tough, not only carrying your gear on a regular 70, 80 pounds of gear, 50 kilos, whatever you want to call it, but trying to climb up mountains when you're not conditioned to do so, when it's bitterly cold. And then also you're fighting an unseen enemy who is just voraciously coming at you nonstop. And with the cold weather, it can get about as tough as possible. Morale is one of the things that keeps forces moving. And if you don't have morale, and if it wasn't for the esprit de corps of the Marines or some Army units that really relied back on their history, or yes, it's tough for everybody. And commanders would show would lead from the front on this. The best ones would, and the Chinese as well. It was essentially march or die type of thing. So the cold is the great equalizer, and this is what causes a lot of problems for both sides, but particularly for the U.S. at the beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, the battles, and I separate it into three parts if I can here. So the next slide, please, David. Let's see. So I break it into three because it's really, when I review it and you read through it, it's almost like 1,000 separate battles that are happening, because it's not like there's one open battlefield like Waterloo or Gettysburg where you can see the left flank and you can see the right flank and you know what's coming over the hill. These are ravines and terraces and chasms and precipices and hard to negotiate roads and not well paved, in some cases, single lane gravel roads. And so you can see where Chosin is located up at the very top end of the map there. This is deep into North Korean territory. And you can see Hungnam, which is where they're going to exfiltrate from, and then the current demilitarized zone. So the U.S. forces and Korean forces and outer forces had pushed all the way up to the outer boundaries of the Yalu River on the western flank. The Chosin River they were moving up, and I'll tell you why the Marines got hung up there for a while. And there was an eastern movement as well. But the Chinese are already infiltrating en masse. And so then you have, and I'll talk about essentially map by map as you go from the center map, essentially what it looked like and where the attacks happened. And then I have a clearer and simpler map to talk about, and it kind of spaces it out in time as to how the divisions from the Chinese in red kept attacking as they were moving through these choke points. And then the last map shows Hungnam. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, not a static fight. And although there were stands made as rear guards, protective actions, there were literally platoons that would just stay and say, we're going to hold the ground while the rest of the force exfiltrates, and we hope we can hold. In some cases, they were overrun immediately. In some cases, Marine units like Easy Company and Fox Company for the 7th Marine Regiment. There's a book that talks about it a little bit later on. I'll show Last Stand of Fox Company. It was eye-watering how they would hold off Chinese hordes and masses for 5 days at a time, down to 90% casualties in their units. The U.S. was literally surrounded when the fighting started. Now, what you see on the map here is as they're progressing south and things are happening at the Chosin Reservoir, the Chinese have already not only surrounded them to the north, but they're already understanding that they need to attack along the way, because they understand if they push back, they're going to be pushing back the forces. Now, in general, MacArthur was ordering Allman to move all the forces quickly to the Yalu River to meet his goal of the war being done by Christmas time. The Marines were not only, but these were like not one large advance, everybody was advancing in a picket line, for instance. But what it was 4 different movements throughout the different ravines and byways and what little roads, undeveloped roads that were in the North Korea. The Marines were smack dab in the middle with the Army division on their left and Army divisions on their right to provide the flanking. General Smith sensed that something was not right, and he did not want to move as quickly and overextend his forces. And so what he did was kind of held back a little bit when he got to the Changin Reservoir and said, even though Alman was pressing him and getting pissed off and saying, you need to move quicker, I'm getting pushed by MacArthur. General Smith said, and they already had kind of a contentious relationship originally, was like, no, we don't want to overextend, because not only were the Allies extended over a 400-mile front, but there wasn't like a immediate handover or that's my left line of limit, so I know who's on my left flank or right flank. You couldn't see these forces, so you could quickly become isolated. As the attacks happened, the Marines understood that the advance was going to stop, and now they were just holding ground. And we're talking about forces of Chinese of thousands coming over the hills, racing up to the terrain, whether it was on the roads or whether they were trying to infiltrate them or enfilade them. And the Marines were essentially, by a force, trying to move south but also having units stand their rear guard. This is where the famous line from Oliver Smith or Chesty Puller comes, "Oh, good, we're surrounded. We can attack in any direction." Yes, but if you try to have one kind of overview of the battle, it's 1,000 little battles, and there are some that probably will never be known about, and there are some that, of course, are celebrated. I'll talk about the number of medal honors that are awarded to U.S. service members here, second only to the Marine Corps, to the battle, or sorry, for the services to the Battle of the Bulge. So this is how tough the fighting was and how heroic it was. At this particular point, there's a First Lieutenant Yancey who understands that his forces, if he doesn't hold the fort in his particular part, and he was Easy Company of the 7th Marine Regiment, if he didn't hold the line, others were gonna suffer. So famously, at least in Marine Corps lore, he takes a rifle with a bayonet, he puts it into the ground and says, "No Chinese will pass this line here," and his troops defended that one, significant or insignificant act of just saying no one shall pass. This is where the Marines held the line. Now, the casualties in these companies were unbelievable. Yancey ends up dying. Walter Phillips from Fox Company, last stand of Fox Company. At the end of the fighting, he was the only serving officer, along with maybe I think 20% of his troops. Everybody else was either killed, missing, or evacuated as wounded. So this is brutal, difficult fighting. They're attacking at night. The Chinese would either sneak up and do it very quietly, or they would sound horns and shoot up flares, and everybody knew it was coming. And kudos to the bravery of the Chinese, who would just keep advancing into heavy machine gun fire. They had left their big guns behind to move quicker into the valleys and to quickly surround the forces. So they didn't have the artillery, nor did they have the air that was necessary that the Marines would eventually have. The Marines are firing their weapons, they're firing their cannons, they're firing their artillery. And like I said, December 1st, the air starts arriving and really pulverizing in, because the way we in the Marine Corps use aviation as if it's airborne artillery. So this really takes place from 27 November down through, if you get to, there's 2 major inflection points, Haguru-ri and Koto-ri, which are 2 points that they were trying to get to, where the Chinese were trying to overtake them before they got there, because those are also depots and main points before they started moving south. And so all the way into the beginning of December. Next slide, please. And you can see, you can move next slide, but you can see the elevation in meters if you want to. This is absolutely almost vertical terrain. And I've flown over these parts, not North Korea, but I've flown over Korea, and man, it is canyon after canyon after crevice after whatever, and it is difficult terrain. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a little bit of a better, it's not obfuscated by the map terrain in the back, and you can kind of get a better idea just from this clear map, which is, not to scale perhaps, but we're talking about, it's a slow running fight. When we say a running fight is, essentially we're not in retreat, and let me talk about retreats, organized or not. That is one of the most difficult things an army, an air force, anybody can suffer in combat. Once the retreat happens, the fear overtakes, and then you lose discipline and control. One of the things that really held on was the leadership of the Marines and the Army in the cases, and also the esprit de corps of the Marines and willing to sacrifice. Some of these reservists have been little trained, some of them literally maybe a few weeks and thrown into the breach. It is easy to surrender, although they knew that if they surrendered, they were probably going to be behind enemy lines for a long time. And for those who did, or unfortunately couldn't do anything but surrender if they were wounded, their survival rate in the camps was very difficult. The problem with this is that you have, it's hard to account for every single person. So missing, overlooked, the left behind, like I said, probably battles that were just momentous and as far as bravery goes, but no one knows because they were just overrun by Chinese, whatever happened. This was a 78-mile long venture over poor roads. So this is not just, hey, we just need to get down the highway very quickly. This is, we got a long way to go, and we're going to be fighting the whole way. And again, testament to the units that are using their weaponry, doing everything they can, using the combined force, the Air Force and the Navy as well, coming in and helping out the day as the weather clears on the 1st of December. It makes the going easier. Certainly not easy though. Also, they were being overlooked by the high ground in combat, almost nonstop by the Chinese, who had seized the high ground. Now, what the Marines ended up doing was also detaching elements to fight over the high ground. They said, if the Chinese can do it, there's a famous quote, the Chinese can do it, we can do it as well. So they were fighting across the mountaintops as they were moving, surprising the Chinese, who did not know that the Marines would ever get off the roads. And so that helped the tide of battle. And also there were instances where the Chinese were so poorly underfed, so cold, when they finally would overrun a camp, they would just start looting everything because they were so hungry, so tired, so cold, that the Chinese would be surprised them in counterattacks. Stories about Marines coming up on Chinese positions, they were just frozen and they're solid and dead in their foxholes. And I'll touch upon, I'm wary of time here, but USMC and naval aviation, you can't overstate the effect of close air support. There's a famous true story about the great Santini, if you've ever read about Pat Conroy's books about his dad, Don Conroy, and he talks about the firepower of these propeller aircraft at the time in the beginning of the jets. And at one point, he's asked to fly over the troops, and I'm about to get goosebumps when I say this, but Don Conroy, the great Santini, who had flown in several combat missions, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, ends up flying over the troops, and so low he could hear like a thunderous crowd roar from the troops who knew the Americans were now providing air support. And he said he got goosebumps in the plane. And as they were dropping napalm. Napalm is a weapon we have not used in a long time. It's jellied gas, fire mixture, but the close air support was so close. They were bombing front lines where sometimes they were causing casualties amongst the Allies, but that's how fighting was so close and tough. The amazing accomplishment that this so much force was saved. I think they only lost a few hundred vehicles, if at most. One cannon slid off the chasm. Almost all the troops that, I think there was 4,000 missing, but really at the end, almost every single troop, and there was a whole bunch of refugees that were coming from North Korea too, that advancing to be evacuated. So I'll talk about that in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the evacuation, I won't spend too much time. It's called the Miracle of Christmas because you can see there was 193 ship armada that was there, not just military vessels, but Allied vessels as well, but civilian as well. 86,000 refugees from the Korea, North or South Korea, were put on ships, and this was considered compared to Dunkirk in the sense that it was, yes, strategically not the best thing that could have happened, but they saved the majority of the force. Now, the North Koreans got to a certain point, the Chinese got to a certain point of the perimeter, and they didn't make it too difficult. They could have, I think they had exhausted their forces and they reached a culmination point for logistics, but you can see there's some defensive lines there in the X-Corps evacuation plan map, which is not too clear, but essentially they were able to protect and get and exfiltrate a whole bunch of forces. Now, ironically, they had made after Incheon, there was a Wonsan on the eastern coast, amphibious envelopment. So some people question whether that was really necessary or not, but okay, it worked once at Incheon, why not at Wonsan? But then there was an amphibious exfiltration out, which is something we practice and do. But thousands of pieces of equipment were saved for later fighting. And of course, as the Chinese advanced, more death and destruction were rained upon them. But again, a strategic defeat, yes. A victory, yes. But both sides paid a price. But this would eventually end up, and I'll go next slide, please, because I'll wrap it up here. Okay, the heroes. I'm going to talk really about the Marine side. We talked about Colonel Chesty Puller, famous for the most decorated Marine in the history of the Marine Corps. Oliver Smith ends up becoming the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, which is the second 4-star that we have. Lieutenant Colonel Don Carlos Faith. He was actually part of, and that's his picture in the middle. He ended up being called Task Force Faith. There was a lot of Marine Corps and Army rivalry internecine between the two services. There always has been. We work close together. We fight close together. But in this particular case, the Army really, and it was at first it was looked at in history that it was all the Marines, but the Army on the right-hand flank, he was actually Task Force Faith or RCT, Regimental Combat Team 31, really did a great job holding off the forces on the eastern flank. And as a lieutenant colonel, really did a fantastic job protecting the eastern flank or right flank of the Marines as you look at it as they were moving up to the north. So he was famously recognized, and I kind of had to refresh myself on him. And then the close air support, the Marines flew, that's an incredible amount of sorties in a short amount of time. Over 40,000 were close air support. Marine helicopters vacuum ordered 9,800 wounded personnel. That's impressive. And then over the course of 14 days, 17 medals of honor for the Army and the Navy. And when we say Navy, that means Marines too. And 78 Service Cross medals, which is the second highest award you can be awarded, only second to the Battle of the Bulge. And I don't have to explain to anybody, the Bulge was a months-long campaign. So just in this short amount of time, the heroism that was displayed on both sides was unbelievable. Next slide, please. And I'm almost to the end here. Aftermath, and you can see the fields of the dead and just the precipitous, difficult terrain that they're fighting in. But this is what they would wake up to in the morning. The scores of dead that were coming, these are all Chinese, as you're coming up to the U.S. lines, fighting from the foxholes. I mean, their bravery, whether they're being told you will charge or die, or whether they were doing it because God, for their love of country or communism, whatever the case may be, there is no doubt that they sacrificed a lot. And you can see the numbers killed. Now, these are rough estimates. We'll never know exactly what the numbers were. For the U.S. estimates, 1,000 killed, 5,000 missing, and those are either completely blown away or just killed and never discovered. Almost 5,000 wounded. And then you look at that, the casualties, 7,338. That's non-battle casualties, and that's either tripping over something, but most likely frostbite, something that trench foot, whatever, concussive actions, whatever the case may be. 15 tank losses, which is not bad considering all the fighting they had to do. And then our estimate of the Chinese casualties, the Chinese estimate of our casualties is 13,900. Where they draw that from, I don't know. And then the Chinese estimates, obviously this is an estimate that's done by the Chinese, the UN, and then the unofficial estimate is over 60,000 casualties. And so that's one half of their force. And like I said, this 9th Army Corps essentially ceased to exist and function for another year or two. So the General Sung was absolutely a brilliant tactician and hard driver, but in the end, his force was rendered ineffective. Next slide, please. And then I think this is my second to last. Okay, the lore and the legacy. This is called the Forgotten War in the U.S. And I think what happened is because after war, the Spanish-American War and the First World War and the Second World War, America was used to winning, and then this was at best a stalemate. And it is still to this day. So for the longest time, it was called the Forgotten War. And this is the first time that the Americans did not lose a war, did not win a war on a major scale. And you can call it a tie, whatever you want, but to this day, we're still on the DMZ. We still have thousands of forces arrayed. We have a major commitment to the South Korean and to Japan. Every time I fly and when I used to deploy, we would practice missions that would take us into fighting in that area. I'll leave it at that. It was a war. It's an award to this day, an armistice, never formally ended. And you can see, and you just have to watch the news, the North Koreans, if they had the chance, or maybe who knows if it's posturing, they have a fanatical force, and it would be a tough fight again. this is some of the most savage fighting America has seen at scale up to this particular point. I know we had, it was terrible in Okinawa and other places, but just the brutality that was exhibited in the first year was amazing. And then this, I have a picture here. This is the memorial that was erected finally in the 90s or 2000s, I think. Finally, a memorial for the Korean soldiers, because there hadn't been one to date. And Vietnam was a similar thing. You know of the wall, but this was created after the wall was for the Vietnam War Memorial. So again, the Forgotten War. I will tell you, at the time, we had baseball players who were playing in the professional leagues. We had actors, people who were volunteered to fight. Famous baseball players ended up in the Hall of Fame, ended up fighting, several, 50 combat missions, whatever. So it was a war against the communist forces at the time. But by the time it was dragging into the fourth year, people were ready for it to stop. So a difficult thing to still reckon with in our history. Next slide, please. Okay. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I wanted to share just a couple books for those who are interested. This Kind of War was written in 1963, so it's kind of a contemporary book. It is not detailed, but it is comprehensive in describing all the things that happened across from a very unique perspective. I highly recommend it. And there are more books than I have read. Last Stand of Fox Company, On Desperate Ground, Frozen Chosen, The Chosen Few, The Coldest Winter. These are all award-winning, fantastic books. And when you read it, you are just amazed what people can survive in the most difficult situations. Okay, last slide, please. And with that, I leave it to my good friend David and Laura, and that's a picture of the war memorial there. I leave it to my friend for questions and any wrap-up or anything I forgot. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Colonel Philip, for your valued presentation. It was been a magnificent lecture, and I am sure that many here have been fascinated by this world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right now, we now open to floor for questions. Remember that you can write them in the chat or raise your hand if you wish to participate in live. So let's start with a few questions from our participants. So, David, tenemos algunas preguntas que tienen los participantes.
Sí, nos han llegado algunas preguntas de los participantes de la Masterclass. La primera de ellas, Laura, dice así. La batalla del Embalse de Chosin, ¿podemos considerarla el enfrentamiento más importante de la Guerra de Corea? ¿Crees que la entrada de China en el conflicto apoyando a Corea del Norte marcó un antes y un después en la guerra, dificultando de esta manera la posibilidad de que Estados Unidos y los países aliados derrotaran a Corea del Norte?
Okay, and the first question is about, can we consider that the Battle of Chosin River as the most important battle of the Korean War? And do you think that China's entry into the conflict in support of North Korea marked a turning point in the war, making it difficult of the US and allied countries to defeat North Korea?
My Spanish is okay, so I caught Dave's first question.
Okay. Perfect.
After that, I lost it. Hey, but no, it is. I love it. I love speaking Spanish, but it's much slower.
Okay.
It's a good question, and I do believe that this is there are so many different actions. There's Heartbreak Ridge, there's Incheon, there's the Pusan Perimeter. I mean, there's fights there's so many different battles. But yes, back to the question, I think this is the most important point. This is the most important battle of the overall war. This was the turning point. There was it was almost a pell-mell, get there as fast as you can to the Yalu River. Forget the Chinese or not. I think we were discounting them at the particular time. But I think this is where we saw that the Chinese are a force to be reckoned with. They had us surrounded. And even though we can look at it as, yes, in the end, they didn't achieve their objectives according to the General Sung and Mao, that they were supposed to decimate the Marines and destroy them completely. The Marines were able to exfiltrate along with other forces and refugees to fight for another day. But as we know, the fighting after this becomes stalemated. Once it gets into 1951, what we're really looking at is just yards and, maybe hundreds of yards, maybe a mile gained or not, and really settles upon the 38th parallel. Not only was this significant retreat or orderly withdrawal, whatever you want to call it. But then the rest of the forces had to pull back too. And then this was the turning point also where MacArthur was essentially, okay, it's time for somebody else to come in. This is when Ridgway came in as the next general. And I think the Chinese definitely made this. I think the North Koreans were on their backs, unable to respond. They had the initial momentum, and then the momentum, essentially was just against them. They were overwhelmed, overmatched. No matter how hard they fought or tenaciously, there were just too many advances in technology that we had. I should say the Allies had over them to fight alone. But China had made it kind of clear, unofficially and officially, like if you go too far, we're going to join. And I think we discounted that. Now, I also want to say too, through China, there was Russian rearmament, and there were reports of Russian fighters in Chinese marked jets as well. Why not? Because this is a perfect testing ground. And one of the classes and one of the things I caught, many years ago was there a pipeline of downed American aviators who were never recovered, spirited to Russia, and forced to work for Russians for years later? This is a very controversial. It's not in the numbers of hundreds, maybe in the 10s or 20s, but there were some that were never accounted for one way or the other. And we think that might have happened. So there was also a Russian presence as well. But when you look at it, at that time, the world was arrayed between essentially capitalism, communism. You could argue in some ways it is today, but not nearly as it was back then. So really, people thought they were fighting, to preserve what had been gained in World War II. But this is also the rise and the ascendancy of the Chinese Republic, and this is where we discovered you can't fight China without going, even if you go total war. And we're still facing this today as a pacing threat, we call it. The Chinese are very advanced, and they have all numbers in China. Everything in China is just huge numbers. The forces they can bring in array is incalculable. Thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you very much, and excellent answer, Colonel Phillips. So we continue with the next question. David, ¿tienes una siguiente pregunta de los participantes?
Sí, la siguiente pregunta dice así: ¿podemos considerar la batalla del río Injin el enfrentamiento más sangriento de la Guerra de Corea, en el que el ejército británico sufrió el mayor número de bajas desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial?
Okay, the next question is about, can we consider that the Battle of Imjin River the bloodiest engagement of the Korean War, in which the British Army suffered the highest number of the casualties since the World War II?
So for the Imjin River, I'd have to, I'm not as familiar. I will tell you that, if I'm not mistaken, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, the Battle of the Imjin River, is that surrounding the Pusan perimeter? Is that the one that I'm thinking of? Or is I want to make sure I have that correct?
Can you repeat?
Yes, I'm not as familiar with the Imjin River battle that the question comes from in the British. I do know the British had fought as a commando brigade, and they also had there's a famous battle called the Gloucester Hill where the regiment held off hordes. I can't speak to that one, but I would say that the British, yes, I would say that was probably the largest bit of fighting the British have done, yes, evidently since World War II. And I would say all the way up until the Falkland Wars. So I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly, but I don't want to speculate because I'm not as familiar with that one.
Yeah, don't worry for that. Excellent answer. Thank you, Colonel Phillips. So we continue with the next question, a third question for the participant. David, tenemos una siguiente pregunta también por parte de algunos.
Dice así: ¿se tiene constancia de las bajas sufridas por el ejército chino en la Guerra de Corea?
The question is about, is there any records of casualties suffered by the Chinese army in the Korean War?
There is, but anytime, it's always difficult. It's always difficult behind the veil of, and they can accuse us of the same thing, behind the Iron Curtain or behind something that happens in China or let's say Vietnam. They're very always hesitant to release records or numbers. I don't know the total numbers. I do know that they lost in proportion much more than we did. And I think it's just a different mindset as far as how they fight and how they attack. Now, again, technology-wise, and China has come much further since then. Technology-wise, it was essentially masses of numbers. Like I said, they left their guns behind. They thought they could do that, but it's just like with the Vietnamese. They didn't necessarily have to have the best equipment. They were just tough, move at night, move concealment. Those are the things that they really excelled at. I would say that, and it's always difficult from behind especially the communist times. It's just like when the Russians would lose a sub, they would never admit it, or it was something else that happened, or even, what happened in Ukraine with the large nuclear reactor that, for the longest time, nobody really knew what happened because it was behind the scenes. Or even today in China, when something happens, it's a little bit, you're not sure what really they're releasing or not. I have not seen casualties from the Chinese, but I know that when you're looking at casualty rates just in the Chosin Reservoir, when we're looking at maybe whatever the number I had total, 7,000, 13,000, and they're losing 60,000 casualties estimated. I mean, that is hard no matter how much depth you have, that is difficult to take as a force, because even if you, let's say, for all those soldiers that you lose that are privates, you have NCOs, non-commissioned officers you're losing, and those are just so hard to replace. You just can't teach that or bring them up fast enough. And as well stocked and dense as their population is, there's a culminating point and there's a difficulty where you just can't take anymore. So anyway, I wish I had a better answer, but I don't want to speculate on that. I think that's a question I'm going to go look up myself, as a matter of fact. But when you look at 4 years of combat that happened in Korea, the numbers are staggering. And I think especially when it was such a when we're looking at, the vast expanse of World War II and World War I, we're literally fighting a world war, and we're seeing the same kind of casualty rates in numbers that are staggering in such a small defined place in the 38th parallel. I mean, this is absolutely a buzzsaw, as we say, as far as you're just feeding troops into a bloodbath. And it's just, I think that's one reason why eventually both sides had to say, no mas,
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colonel. An excellent answer, too.
Thank you.
So we have the final question
Sure.
for this masterclass. Seguimos con una pregunta final para continuar con la programación.
Pues sí, la última pregunta dice así, Laura. ¿Qué pasó finalmente con los marines estadounidenses en la batalla del lago Chosin? ¿Pudieron escapar del cerco? ¿Cuántas bajas sufrieron en la batalla?
And the final question is about what finally happened with the U.S. Marine at the Battle of the Lake Chosin. Were they able to escape the encirclement, or how many casualties did they suffer in the battle?
Well, and maybe this was a pre-written question, but if you look at my slides, I think I put some good casualty numbers there as far as what my research showed. So you could probably draw it from that. It was yes, it was a success from all the regiments with all their companies, and the 1st Marine Division were all able, now minus their numbers of wounded and killed and missing, as intact units were able to successfully exfiltrate. And that's why we look at it as such an important battle in our history. Is even though we were surrounded, we just attacked in a southeasterly direction as far as the Marines go, and we were able to keep intact. And they weren't deserting, and they weren't running off, and they weren't surrendering in hordes or masses. Essentially, we were able to keep all the vehicles. When you look at the number of vehicles that might have been lost compared to what we were able to save, and in the last slide of the evacuation shows that. I mean, the Marines take pride in that, and they will not leave their wounded or killed behind if that's at possible. And then also they were able to bring back the majority and reconstitute and fight again. So it was certainly not like the 9th Army Corps that was decimated and rendered ineffective for the Chinese for another year or two. Those forces for the Americans went right back into the fight in just a different aspect. And then I think the other part of the question was the casualty numbers. And I don't have them off the top of my head, but if you look at the slides, you can see that it was. So, in the Marine Corps lore, if I can answer this question as well, as far as our history goes, Chosin is considered a proud point in our history. Yes, it didn't turn out like we wanted to, but the commander, who was the 2-star, who was essentially telling General Allman, hey, something's not right here. I'm not moving forward faster. I'm not separating my forces. I sense something is wrong. And then just whether that was combat intuitive, and he had served before in World War II, eventually ended up saving the whole force. But the fighting, I just can't, besides reading, obviously I wasn't there, but the fighting that they did to protect themselves, rearguard actions, and orderly withdrawal is something that is just, modern day history, just unbelievable to read about. That's we haven't been faced with a similar situation since, but it is one of those things in history we hold up as a great success. Whether in the end it was strategic defeat, I got it, but what it was the Marines being Marines, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Colonel Phillips.
Sure.
You.
So we are coming to end the masterclass. We sincerely say thank you to Colonel Phillips for his magnificent presentation, and from the International Institute of Global Security Studies, INISEG, we would like to say thank you to all participants, attendees, and speakers who were today. It was been an incredible space of knowledge and question from everyone. Thank you very much to see you at the next international event, and have a good day and good afternoon for everyone. So we finish. Y corte.